Hello and welcome back to another Blender tutorial. Today I'm going to show you 3 methods of adding wireframes to your models. We'll start off with the classic one, the Wireframe Modifier. Next up we have the Freestyle rendering options in Blender. And in the end I'm going to show you my personal favorite, a material-based solution that is also animatable. So to start off, let's take a look at the Wireframe modifier. Okay, so for this version, just select the object you want to add your wireframe to and go to the modifier section. Then click on Add Modifier and under Generate at the very bottom select Wireframe. You can see that we now have the wireframe model of our mesh. Just uncheck this little checkbox next to Replace Original, so we have both the wireframe and our original mesh. And then go to the Material section, add a new material slot by clicking the plus icon at the top here, and then just create a new material called Wireframe. Here you can set up a color if you want to. I'm just going to make this white. Then go back to the modifier section and set this material offset to 2 or to 3 depending on how many material slots you have. In my case I have 3 with the wireframe, meaning that the first one needs to go 2 slots further and the second one needs to go 1 slot further. So if I just set this to 2, this material offset, it will go 2 slots further, or this gray one will just go 1 slot further because it can't go to a 4th slot. And that's essentially already it. You can of course set up the thickness 0.05, make it a bit thinner, and then you can essentially just copy over this material to all of the other objects and this modifier. I'm just going to add this in for most of the objects. Okay, I'm just going to leave it at that. And if I render this out right now, you can see that we get our little robot with the wireframe all over him. Moving on to the next one on the list, the Freestyle rendering engine. Okay, for this version, just go into Edit mode, then press A to select everything, every face. Then press Ctrl E to bring up this Edge menu and select Mark Freestyle Edge. Now all these edges should turn green or yellow. Go out of edit mode and repeat this for every object you want the effect to be on. So again, Ctrl E, Mark Freestyle Edges. This one has a curve modifier, that's why it looks so weird. Okay, once you are done with that, go into the render section and just enable Freestyle with this little checkbox. Then if you go to the render layer section, you'll see that a huge new area has appeared here with lots of settings, but all we are going to do is activate this checkbox here next to Edge Mark, and this way it's going to render out all of the edges that we've just marked as a line. So if I render this out, you can see that we get this black overlay for every object which we have this effect applied on for the wheels, for the body, the head, the arm. And yeah, that's about that. And our final candidate, a method using the wireframe node in the Cycles material editor. Alright, for this method you want to start by going to the render layer section and just add in a new render layer and call it, for example, wireframe. Next up, go to the material section and make sure that you have selected an object which is visible in the viewport. For this example, I'm going to use the head. Remove the current material and add in a new one, which I'm going to call wire. Now split up the view and open a node editor. Next up, delete this default diffuse shader and replace it with an emission shader. And now comes the important part. Again, add a new one and go to Input Wireframe to get this wireframe node. Place it here and select the factor output to the color input of the emission node. And you can see we get this wireframe-like look. Now there is this option called pixel size. If you enable it, first of all, the lines get a lot thinner usually. So just to show this, I'm going to increase the size a little bit to like 0.5. Yeah. And what it does, this pixel size, it doesn't, if that is enabled, then it doesn't use the size of the object to draw these lines or to decide how thick the lines should be. Instead, it's going to use the pixels of the camera. So if I go like really close, you can see that the lines become really thin. And if I go further away, the lines get a lot thicker in relation to the object. So usually I like to keep that turned off and then set it to like low value of like 0.0, that's still too big, 0.005 or maybe even smaller, 0.003 for example. Yeah. Usually I think that's better, but maybe that's something for your scene. So this is the basic setup for the wireframe shader. Now make sure that you go back to the old shader so it looks properly like this. Then head back to your render layer, to the render layer section, and underneath here you can see material. So on your wireframe layer, select the wireframe material, and what it does, it replaces all materials on this render layer with this wireframe shader. So we have our main layer, which just renders out the image as usually, and then we have the wireframe layer. And if I now remove the border with Ctrl-Alt-B, by the way, and I'm now going to render this out, and you'll see that we get two versions of the image. There goes the first one, and right after that we get the wireframe version. Down here where it says main, you can actually change this wireframe, that's a wireframe layer, and I've just called it main, that's our wheel render layer. Now go back to the node editor, that's why I left it open, and go to the compositing section by clicking this little icon and enable the checkbox next to use nodes. So now we are in the compositor and we can control our image. First of all, make a duplicate of this render layer node, because we obviously need both render layers in this setup. So change this one to wireframe. And now we need to combine these two. For this I'm going to use a mix node, so go to color, mix, and just plug that in between your main render layer and the composite output, and select your wireframe layer as the second image. Now we need to change this option here from mix, which just mixes the two images like this. We need to change it to add. So all the black parts in the original image are just going to be ignored, and on the white parts it's going to add in this white wireframe. So we get this look. Now with the factor input you can make this weaker or stronger. I would like to use a value of like 0.25, maybe even a bit lower, 0.2. Yeah, you can decide this one for yourself. And that's the basic setup done, like this. But of course you can add a few more options there. For example, go ahead and add in, I'm just going to use the search function for this one, add in a box mask and a math node like this. And now we replace the wireframe layer on your mix or add node with this math node and plug the image into the first input and this box mask into the second one. And if we now set this one to multiply, you can see that we can effectively control where this wire should appear using this mask. So if I set this one to a height of 1 and maybe a width of 0.5 or maybe a bit lower, 0.3, then we have this like one column that goes through here and we can control it, the position, which part of the image actually gets this wireframe. And if we want to make this even prettier, we can make it a bit smaller, maybe 0.15. And to add more prettiness, we can add in a blur node right in between the box mask and the math node. I'm going to set this to fast Gaussian since it's just a mask, and set this scale to like 10 and 20. That's pretty much maybe 10. And if we now move our mask across, you can see that we get this like beautiful, slowly fading in pattern here, which we can now actually animate. So we can go like first frame X position 0.1, and then maybe last frame X position, I don't know what looks good, yeah, 0.9 maybe. So across our 150 frames it just like moves slowly from left to right, which is a really cool effect in my opinion. Of course, here with this math node you can do all sorts of effects. You can add textures in there, you can use other masks to exactly control which part of the image should get the wireframe effect. So this is a really flexible method. And still you can obviously just set this to 0 and just keep your original image, meaning that you don't need to render anything twice, just use the normal one. Okay, now that we know how each of these ways work, let's quickly summarize their possibilities and limitations. The Wireframe Modifier is very easy to add and is the only one that actually generates new geometry, and thus probably the best looking one. In addition, it can be applied or not applied to each object individually, which can of course also become a problem if you have a scene which has lots of modifiers on it already, since then you need to click your way through the entire scene and add the wireframe to each object individually. Freestyle rendering is definitely the most flexible one amongst this selection, allowing for things like dashed lines and letting you precisely choose which edge you want to appear in your wireframe model. But it also has a few downsides. Just like the wireframe modifier, these freestyle edges need to be marked for each and every object individually, and the fact that the wireframe model is essentially being burned into the current render layer, forcing you to re-render the entire scene if you don't want the wireframes, combined with the additional render time for line drawing, makes freestyle rendering the slowest method on this list. The material-based method has speaking for it that it is the fastest method on here, only adding a few seconds to the second render and the compositing. It also is the easiest one to animate, but there's also a big problem with it. The wireframe node always reads out all of the geometry with all the modifiers applied and displays it as triangles. So if you have a really high poly scene, it basically becomes unusable because everything just turns white and you have to switch to freestyle rendering or the wireframe modifier. Okay, I hope this guide was helpful for you. If so, you might want to check out this other tutorial I made or take a look at some other stuff on my channel. I plan on making more tutorials like this in the next month, so subscribe if you liked it, and I'll see you then.